Welcome everyone, Christine here on Serious Gaming with something a bit different than the usual stuff that I cover on this channel. Fanfiction. There's plenty of good fanfiction stories out there for almost any universe that you might want to talk about, but they get lost in a mire of mediocre or crappy stories. So these are my top 10 Game of Thrones / Song of Ice and Fire stories. For the record, this is based on my personal preferences, and I'm also a fan of the books, but I'm not a fan of the show, with the exception of the fact that the show has some really good casting and it helps you visualize a lot of places, like the Wall, Winterfell, King's Landing, etc. But I feel the show is a pretty big letdown. It didn't need to be, but it ended up being one. So anyway, at number 10 on this list, Charles Dance saves Westeros by High Plains Drifter on fanfiction.net. This one is a sort of self-insert, though not in the traditional way. In most self-inserts, it's someone close to the person writing the story with a similar personality or similar understanding, similar knowledge. In this case, it's Charles Dance replacing Tywin Lannister just before the War of Five Kings. And hilarity ensues, as they say. Though in this case, it's Charles Dance deciding whether or not he might save Westeros, because readers will never find a more wretched world of scum and villainy than this. And it does go into some brutal actions, some reasonable amount of brutality. It's not a particularly long story compared to the others that I'll link in this video, but it is certainly a worthwhile read. There's quite a few moments of Charles being a magnificent bastard in this story, and on top of that, what really sells it, even though it's the shortest, even though it's incomplete, and might not ever be finished, it has been a while since it's been updated, even despite all of that, what really sells it is the style of writing. It's like a theater play, and it really does create, I guess you could say, a certain sense of it. Not intensity, but it really makes you engaged as a reader. It's something that's a joy to read, as a genuine joy to read, because you're not necessarily, with a lot of fan fictions, you're interested in some event or you're interested in some outcome. Here, it's a genuine joy just to read this story moment to moment. And there's plenty of stories, fanfiction stories, where that is simply not the case. Hell, there's many stories, many books out there where this is not the case, where you don't necessarily enjoy the moment to moment. And this is something that George R.R. Martin himself said. It's like, why do you talk so much about food and all that? Because he said, I want you to feel like you're in the room there. This doesn't necessarily succeed on that level, but it does engage the reader. And that is a great success story for any writer, especially for a fan fiction writer. There's some pretty good fan fictions of this vein, though very rare on this particular level. So, number 10, Charles Dance saves Westeros. Hopefully it will get finished or at least updated. And number 9, the title of this one is a bit ridiculous. It's from Archive of Your Own, and it's Joffrey from Game of Thrones replaced with Octavian from Rome. So Octavian from the Rome TV show replaces Joffrey in Game of Thrones, right as the Lannisters, Baratheons arrive at Winterfell. And this sets off a chain of events politically that changes the entire course of Westeros, and there's notes indicating that Joffrey would create his own version of the Roman Empire. It's intriguing because this is a real case of a magnificent bastard. And one has to understand, Octavian is one of the most important figures in history. And even though this is copying the one from Rome, which certainly doesn't compare to the historical version, it still manages to capture the essence of who someone like Octavian would be. And it really succeeds in selling that. As opposed to the spoiled brat that is Joffrey Baratheon, we get one of the most brilliant men, or in this case boys, in all of history, leading the Seven Kingdoms quite successfully. Although this is more about, this story is unfinished, it's unlikely to ever be completed, but what there is, the 26 chapters that there are for the story, 50,000 words, not the longest, far from it on this list, What there is more about the ascension to the throne than anything else. But still, it's pretty interesting to read. It has a nice premise, and it's certainly something that could create plenty of ideas for other fanfiction writers to follow through on. So, worthwhile reading this one. And number 8. And this is a bit of a more difficult choice. And the reason it's a bit of a more difficult choice for me is I followed the story as it was written. It's a fairly long one. It's complete. The author did update it quite regularly, did engage with his readers. But I'm putting it at number 8 because of my personal preference. It's called A Shadow and a Wolf. So Tyrion weds Sansa. The premise is Tyrion weds Sansa, as obviously happens canonically. But what ends up happening is Tywin dies because of a heart failure early on in the story. So it basically leaves Tyrion and Sansa to pick up the pieces. Very long story, great deal of effort, great engagement from the author. Should be higher. What I dislike here is that even though there's a lot of effort, there's a lot of detail, there's plenty of time put into it, into taking the story seriously. It tells a great character story between Tyrion and Sansa, those being the main characters. And it does tackle world building, world events, etc., and other characters quite well. The problem I have here is there's a certain element or significant element of a holier-than-thou attitude from certain characters. It falls into a trap as like the main characters are right, the people opposing them are either stupid or evil or they're not worth your attention. And I feel that's something that lets the story down to a degree, and it certainly gets irritating. It doesn't really feel like Song of Ice and Fire should. Now, that's not necessarily a problem. You can certainly take Song of Ice and Fire in different directions, or you can take many universes in different directions, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, etc. But I feel there is a letdown in a way, especially with all the moralizing. So that's why it goes to number 8. And number 7, a story that's incomplete, likely never to be finished, but it's a pretty reasonable one. A Brynden Tully self-insert, Blackfish Out of Water, as it's called. And this follows a self-insert character as the Blackfish, going to Essos and founding his own mercenary company. And it leads to a fairly interesting story whereas Brynden Tully goes from one campaign to another, creating and leading a mercenary company against various opponents. The story is unlikely to ever be finished, but there is, in a sense, a completion of an arc as he fights the various mercenary companies and various military forces that exist in Essos. Probably the only exception is the Dothraki, really. For the most part, he fights and defeats everyone else. And following that journey along, seeing how it plays out, is quite nice. Many stories, many writers fail to handle the military aspect very well in most of their stories. This one does do a reasonable job at that, and that's why it's at number 7 on this list. And number 6, and this one can be a bit of an odd one. It's called Wearing Robert's Crown. It's a self-insert of a character as Robert Baratheon right after the Battle of the Trident, but you never have a point of view from Robert's perspective. But it is interesting to see how all of it plays out, how other characters react to a self-insert, how they view it. It certainly is a unique way of doing a self-insert, as opposed to the character's personal thoughts, who is self-insert, things get handled from an outside perspective. It is Robert actually being a competent king and doing a pretty good job of all things that are happening around Westeros until the White Walkers appear. Again, incomplete story like many others, but pretty reasonable amount of effort put into it, and certainly a unique perspective. I feel Robert Baratheon is a character that should be looked down a lot more by the fan base of Song of Ice and Fire. He was an absolutely terrible king. But it's an interesting one that to see a story that has reasonable politicking, war, world building, character building, etc. Just a shame that it's never going to be finished. But at number 6, Wearing Robert's Crown by Drakensis. And number 5, it's A Wolf Amongst Lions by Calypso. This is a character-driven story with not the greatest world building or the best handling of characters outside of the main ones. But it's basically a story that can be summed up like this. It's the building of a father-daughter relationship between Tywin Lannister in Game of Thrones in the show universe, at least in terms of the main things. It's the show universe, though there's elements borrowed from the books, and Arya Stark. So there's the development of father-daughter relationship and how that impacts the world of Song of Ice and Fire. It starts as Arya is at Harrenhal. This is a deviation from the books. Tywin Lannister was portrayed far better in the show, as in a more positive light in the show than he was in the books. Mainly because Charles Dance, but also because in the books are written from a character point of view. So when we deal with Tywin, it's generally from Tyrion's point of view. And obviously, Tyrion gets treated like shit by Tywin. He doesn't have a high opinion of his father either. So that doesn't create the best opinion of him. Obviously, other characters reference him, but the main one that has interactions with Tywin is Tyrion for clear and obvious reasons. I actually don't think Jaime has any point or has any interaction or a very limited interaction in the books with Tywin. Certainly, we don't have a character chapter from Jaime's point of view with Tywin. I don't think so. If memory might be fuzzy on this. But anyway, in the books, Arya never met Tywin or had some very limited interactions. Whereas in the show, they basically had her as his cupbearer, which she was before Roose Bolton. So different character interaction, different dynamic. And the way Tywin acted, the way he behaved, the way he looked, and all that, quite different. Though kept the essence of the character, just added a bit more to it. So this story explores that kind of relationship where Tywin finds out, thanks to Littlefinger, that he has Arya Stark under his nose and uses her as a bargaining chip, forces Robb Stark to submit, and then from there on the story is developed. The Red Wedding doesn't happen, but things develop in a different way. Various conflicts arise that they have to deal with. There's drama, there's complications, there's conflict. It's a fairly long story. By fairly long, I mean that the longest book in Song of Ice and Fire has something around the mark of 410,000 words. This one has 472,000 in 108 chapters plus an epilogue. It's a story that there's been a lot of effort put into it, even though there isn't as great world building as there should be, or the handling of various conflicts, characters outside the main ones is not as handled as well as it could have. But it's a story that started out as a concept of building a relationship between Tywin and Arya and taking it from there, and something the author herself said that she wanted to do in 20 chapters. And then she indulged herself and ended up with a story that's 107 chapters plus an epilogue. Quite long, quite interesting, quite epic. And I'll give credit to the author. Many fanfiction writers, they don't have any regular update schedule. You can have a lot of stories being abandoned. You can have a lot of stories where you might get a lot of updates all at once and then nothing for months. That can happen. It does happen quite frequently. In this particular story's case, the writer updated it regularly on a fairly strict schedule and kept to that schedule, and that is something to be very much appreciated. It doesn't matter how great the story is if it's going to be abandoned, if it's going to be let go by the writer. In many cases, that does happen. So this one, lots of respect for the writer, for how she handled things, lots of respect for the story she wrote, how she handled the character interactions between Tywin and Arya. I feel that there was an attempt to make Tywin look better than he is, which I personally didn't feel was necessary. But it's certainly a very nice story. Not necessarily to my personal taste. I have different desires in stories, but it's something that hooked me in. It's something that I enjoyed reading from the very beginning until the end. And it's recently completed, so if you want to read a good story about these two characters, this is the one I'd certainly recommend. It's something that the show did with the books. This is one of the better parts of the show. There were points in the first few seasons, the first 2-3 seasons, where they had developments that were genuinely positive, that they added on things in the books that never happened in the books, or they made changes that were actually positive. This, Tywin interacting with Arya was certainly a positive element, and yet that's never really been approached very well from a fan fiction point of view. Here in the story it is, and it's a great story as a result of it. And that's number 5. And number 4, imagine combining Warhammer 40k with Song of Ice and Fire, and you get Let the Galaxy Burn, the space opera. It's quite epic and grand in scale. In fact, this is the stated purpose behind this fanfiction as written by the author behind it. It's quite long, it's quite epic, it's Song of Ice and Fire on a galactic scale, with significant influences from Warhammer 40k. It's bloody, it's brutal, it sees the worst and best in humanity at the same time. It's a fiction where it's a fiction that retains the identity of Song of Ice and Fire despite being set in a futuristic setting in space. And with the scale of not quite a galaxy, but certainly pretty large scale in space with the 7 kingdoms. It's something that manages to retain the identity of Song of Ice and Fire, a medieval fantasy setting in a futuristic space setting. So that's quite a lot. That's quite a significant achievement. It recreates war on a massive scale, and yet still manages to feel to have the suitable feeling for what you'd expect in this particular kind of setting, or in this particular type of universe. Things are different. It doesn't follow the same timeline. There is divergence. Specifically, Rhaegar Targaryen wins the battle on the Trident against Robert Baratheon. And obviously things take a change. Though Rhaegar Targaryen ends up being just as much of a lunatic as his father, and things go pretty badly for the 7 kingdoms as a result of it. It has a lot to it, a lot that makes it work. Different character perspectives, characters that are quite well written, characters that you can relate to, and there's characters who are simple monsters. Gregor Clegane in this one, for instance, would make the Dark Eldar of Warhammer seem nice in comparison, considering the things he gets up to, which is quite an achievement by the writer of this fan fiction, that he manages to portray the brutality of war and the brutality of certain characters in such a way. The only criticism I'd give to this story is it's a bit much in some ways. It's fine to have brutality in a fan fiction like this, but it kind of gets trivialized when you just go from one brutal action to another, brutal conflict to another, brutal battle to another. And on top of that, it just kind of feels cheap when quite a few battles are also one-sided. And that's certainly the case here. But for a fiction that explores an alternate universe and an alternate timeline, it certainly does quite well. It builds a world, builds a universe, builds up great characters, and builds up quite something that is suitably epic and grand. And that was the goal. It was achieved. Certainly worth reading. And number 3, we go from Warhammer to Lord of the Rings, the Lannisters of Middle-earth. Hear me roar. Quite a nice piece of fiction where the Westerlands gets transported into Western Gondor, basically replaces far Western Gondor at the beginning of the War of the Five Kings. So you have Tywin, Jaime, Tyrion, Cersei. So all the Lannister characters and their armies and their lands obviously get transported to the western reaches of Gondor, just as the War of the Ring is really about to kick off. And this leads these characters, the main Lannister characters, down their own journey, The main ones being, of course, Jaime, Tyrion, Cersei, though Tywin is also on his own journey, and certainly so is Sandor Clegane, and also quite honestly, Joffrey is on his own journey, though he's still the little shit that we all know and hate. But his journey, spoiler alert, is quite amusing in its own right. I mean, here's Joffrey, a character that is very difficult to redeem, but he's not a clownishly evil character, Satan character that you see typically. Instead, he is evil in the sense that, oh, I'm gonna get the One Ring. Oh, I failed. No, never mind, I'll go home. I'll be escorted home, and while I'm escorted home, I'm gonna run away, find goblins, join said goblins, lead said goblins on an invasion of the Westerlands to claim the glorious crown that he already owns. It's not necessarily a great plan that he engages in, but it's pretty interesting all the same. Joffrey leading an army of tens of thousands of goblins against the home of his relatives, of the kingdom that he is the ruler of. Ends up working as well as you'd expect for him, but it's certainly an interesting storyline. So is Tywin Lannister deciding, I'm gonna go punish Sauron, not realizing exactly what he's gonna deal with, coming face to face against the Witch King. So does Jaime, which ends as well as you'd expect. But still, this is a story that really takes these characters, dumps them in the Lord of the Rings universe, and they have to react to that. And although the story is never going to be finished, what there is of it so far is pretty damn entertaining. So, hear me roar, check it out, pretty good one. Now that I've talked about the Lannisters in Lord of the Rings, how about Song of Ice and Fire becoming Lord of the Rings in some ways? Some changes made to it to make them more aligned with that. And so we get Robb Returns at number 2. Robb Returns is Song of Ice and Fire. It starts off as a time travel story at the beginning. What Red Wedding happens, the gods aren't pleased about that, so they send Robb Stark back in time to where it all began at Winterfell. And this sets in motion chain of events that culminates in, so far, avoiding the War of Five Kings. Who knows how things will develop. Crucially, this is a move by the writer. This is a way for the writer to move away from what you usually get in Song of Ice and Fire to more of a high fantasy type setting. Characters are more heroic, redeemable, and so on. And the journey that they're on, there's a lot more magic, there's a lot more legends added to the story, and there are clear-cut references to Lord of the Rings. So it's, dark fantasy, what you could describe as Song of Ice and Fire being transformed into high fantasy, and it quite works because there's quite a good amount of effort by the author to actually make it happen. And it's still being updated, not quite constantly, actually, but still being updated, and hopefully we will see an end. Certainly long, epic, and worth your time. And finally, we get to number 1, Groundhog Day in Song of Ice and Fire, with our dearly beloved Joffrey Baratheon. That's the premise of the story. Whenever Joffrey dies, he gets transported back in time to just a few days after Jon Arryn died. And this goes as well as you'd expect for Joffrey. So his first death, Purple Wedding, gets transported back in time, sets off a chain of events where Joffrey takes different actions early on, trying to get his revenge, ends up going poorly for him time and time again. He ends up dying over and over and over again until he abandons his efforts. Then he engages in other efforts. He studies at the Citadel, learns various crafts, learns various sciences, becomes a master at quite a few of them. and then he sets out to explore the world, one life at a time. A lot of the time, actually, he takes his own life. So it's a whole character arc, whole significant character development through each life that Joffrey Baratheon goes through. It literally spans, I guess, centuries when you add it all up together. He becomes the captain of a ship. He hunts whales in the far reaches of the earth, and eventually he ends up in one life after another. He eventually ends up in ET, which is, I guess, the equivalent of China in Song of Ice and Fire. And from there, the main storyline starts taking fold, which is the White Walkers. Joffrey joins one of the five forts. So the five forts, there's not a lot of information about this place in the world from George R. R. Martin, but there is something mentioned, the five forts. Now Joffrey joins this system, which is, joins the scouts of the five forts, rises through the ranks, and then eventually the White Walkers come to into play. He continues rising through the ranks, especially as his superiors end up falling to the White Walkers, and the little shit that we all know and hate ends up being a hero leading the last stand of humanity against the White Walkers in fantasy China in Song of Ice and Fire. It's a pretty epic transformation for Joffrey Baratheon, and it's very well told. One of the things that's been stated about George's work is that he wanted people to feel as if they're in the room. That's why he focuses so much on describing things. And on top of that, you also have the Red Wedding. The Red Wedding is one of the greatest pieces of literature that I've read personally, because there's a huge intensity to that particular chapter. It's worth reminding that George is a writer that's also handled horror stories, and that's certainly shown in his handling of the Red Wedding. It's a particularly fantastic chapter in the third book that he writes there that really turns what you'd expect in a story like this on its head. Plenty of people dislike that, but it's really a fantastic decision by George R. R. Martin. But then the intensity, though, of it, the intensity of that particular chapter, you can find a great deal of intensity in this fiction. The Purple Days of Joffrey. There's a great deal of intensity in many of the chapter and much of the fan fiction here, and it makes you feel it. It makes you care about the character. It makes you care about the characters that are on this journey with Joffrey, helping Joffrey along his journey, even when the world eventually is reset and they are eventually discarded. It's certainly worth a read. Of all the stories here, this is the one where I could say I cared the most personally about the main character and some of the other characters. And some moments are pretty difficult to digest, but pretty epic, pretty grand in its own way, and certainly worth it. So that's all. That's my list of top 10 fan fictions for Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire. If people want to comment, give their thoughts on these stories, or recommend other stories that might be worth a read, please do so in the comments below. And if you would like to help me out, considering the overall situation on YouTube, please either support me via Patreon in the link in the video, or donate via PayPal in the link in the description of this video. Thanks for watching, and Costin here, signing out.